This episode is brought to you in part by MixFlip, the ultimate portfolio player for mixing and mastering engineers. Learn more at mixflip.io and use the promo code MYM to save $5 off your first paid month. Hey, welcome to the Master Your Mix podcast. My name is Mike Navina, and thanks for hanging out with me today. Today, my guest is Robin Schmidt, and if you're not familiar with him, Robin is a mastering engineer based out of Germany who has been nominated for Grammy Awards. He's worked on multiple gold and platinum records. He's worked with artists such as The 1975, Placebo, Liam Gallagher, The Pixies, Royal Blood, Two Door Cinema Club, Elton John. He has worked on so many big records. And in today's conversation, we dive deep into his process and we talk about some of the projects that he's worked on. And mainly we focus on a band called The 1975. If you're not familiar with them, you should definitely check them out. They're an awesome band. They're massive, but I'm a big fan of that band. So I wanted to learn a little bit more about what goes into working on their projects, especially because if you listen to their discography, every one of their songs is very different and their records are very eclectic. They tend to have a lot of diversity as far as, rock songs, pop songs, songs that have like drum and bass influence, orchestral stuff. There's a lot of different sounds in there. And so I was curious to ask Robin a lot about creating consistency in records. When you have an artist that is very diverse in their sound, like how do you make records that flow from beginning to end and song to song in a way that's not distracting? How do you make it so that it feels cohesive? So we dive a lot into that and some of the techniques that he's doing to get that and some of his processes just as far as how he's analyzing the tracks to get that consistency. So if you're mastering records, you know that consistency is very important. And sometimes songs all sound the same and that makes the process very easy. Other times you're going to have a rock song followed by a ballad. Sometimes you're going to have just different genres of music. Sometimes you're going to be working on a compilation record. So all of these variables can really make for a big challenge when it comes to mastering records. So we dive into that. And we also dig into his process as far as getting impact with songs. And he shares some tips as far as how he goes about making certain sections of songs really jump out and have extra energy. And it's a way that, you can certainly apply to mixing, but a lot of mixing engineers overlook this step. And so I think that whether you're a mastering engineer or not, whether you want to focus on that or not, if you're just mixing records, there is a lot that you can learn from this episode to help you with your mixes. So with that said, let's just jump right into it. Robin Schmidt, thank you so much for being on the Master Your Mix podcast. How are you doing today?
Good, thank you. How are you?
Doing great. For people who might not be familiar with you and who you are, what you do, and how you got into music production and ultimately mastering, can you give us that background?
Sure. Where do I start?
Wherever you want.
All right. Well, okay. I grew up as one of three brothers and we all played instruments. And quite early on, I started to get interested playing in bands, played in a few, started engineering on stuff. There was nobody to ever set the mixing desk in the rehearsal space. So that was always my job. And then you wanted to, play a little show. And I was the one setting the mixer for that. And sooner or later, we started recording some demos. And that's how I've kind of gotten into recording. Then later, the question is, okay, what do you do after school? And I thought studying this stuff would be really cool. That was totally my thing. And but it was a difficult time here in Germany. There weren't really that many private schools, and you were expected to stay in school, finish school until you're maybe, say, 19, and then go to university and do all that. And at the time, it was quite strict and quite white lab coat kind of engineering thinking in Germany. So the idea was, you become a sound engineer, you go to the school, and it didn't have much to do with pop and rock music or even jazz music for that matter. But there was this cool school in England that I've heard of that had just opened. It had opened in the old boys' school of Paul McCartney. And he, along with some other people, had worked to kind of make that a new school for musicianship, acting, sound recording, management. So basically, the idea was you learn the pop and rock trade from people who actually work in the trade. You go there for 3 years, you get lots of hands-on experience. And that seemed very good at the time. So I was kind of eyeing that. The only trouble is they didn't take very many people. So they took only about 30 people per subject per year. And that was the first kind of that school in Europe. So that's not a lot of people. So I applied and they invited me over for an interview and talked to me what I was envisioning for myself. And then Then they swiftly agreed to say, no, you can't come here. Go back and finish school. So I went back, and I was very unhappy in school because from the age of maybe 12 or 13, I knew what I wanted to do. So I knew I wanted to do sound, and music was exactly my thing. So then I quit school, and I applied a second time at that university and told them, well, now I've stopped going to school, so screw you. And I took some GCSEs. That's like a test in maths to prove that I'm good enough to go there. And they agreed, and they took me on. So then during that time, I got to meet a lot of people and got into mastering in that time, because it was right around the time when you could first buy an own CD burner, and you could have a cool new software called Wavelab 1.0 and do your own mastering at home. And I thought that was kind of cool. So, I mean, previously you always had to rely on other people. You had to send it away or go someplace to get your music onto CD, but you could do it yourself. And that seemed cool. I felt really grown up kind of getting into that. So that feeling kind of stuck. I always enjoyed doing that. And after that university, I kept working in studios and did some live sound, but then I got into mastering and built my studio from there.
That's awesome. It's interesting because, like, you talked about how you started kind of in the mixing realm, and it kind of seemed like maybe that was a bit of a necessity when you were in a band. Like, someone in the band needed to run the board and do that, but ultimately you ended up in the mixing side of it. Do you feel like you kind of had to? Do you feel like you have to learn mixing as a mastering engineer to like understand what to do in mastering, or do you think you could just jump right into mastering?
I don't know, actually. I would tend to say yes, you have to learn it, but that's just because that's what I did. I mean, there are lots of people like Bob Ludwig, probably the greatest mastering engineer of all time. He's a classically trained trumpet player. And let me see. Oh, I forget the name, but the guy at Sterling Sound, like Ted Jensen, I think he came more from a stereo, like selling and repairing old hi-fi audiophile equipment, kind of from that side. And, on the production side, there's also the story of Rick Rubin being more of a super fan than a musician or an engineer himself. So who knows? I guess there are many, many ways into it. And you're going to have a kind of a different angle to things. And it helps me immensely. Playing instruments myself, talking about music to musicians, I feel like it's a good thing that they know what I'm talking about. I use the same language as they do, and that helps. But I have to be open to the fact that that's kind of optional. You can do it that way, but there seem to be other venues to it.
Mm-hmm. No, I think you bring up a really good point there, that it's, as far as a service level thing goes, like being able to communicate with the clients and, understand what they just went through in the recording and mixing stage of things. Like, if you understand that part, then it makes it easier to connect the dots and to make them feel comfortable that you know what you're doing. And it's not just like, I just tweak some knobs at the end, like instead you actually understand the whole process and how it all comes together. And I'm sure that, there's probably times when you find yourself having to maybe tell them to go back to the mix to fix certain things that,
but
that's part of it.
It kind of helps if you speak the same language, and they can tell you something like, oh, look, in that second half of the pre-chorus, there's the backbeat has too much oomph, and I want it to be a little bit more, and you kind of know what they're talking about. That could be really quite a steep learning curve if you haven't played yourself or mixed yourself or engineered yourself. So you the chances are quite good that I know a few stages that they're in and what they're trying to say. But quite often I still don't know it. My guess is as good as anyone's. So,
yep.
If they say something like, oh, it sounds too black, I want it to be more white, then I kind of have to guess what they mean by that. But other than that, there's a lot of musical talk.
Yeah, well, of course, I was just about to say, like, oomph and whatever. It's like that could be so many things, right? It's hilarious how musicians communicate that kind of stuff, and we it's like a feeling, and we try to express it in the weirdest ways. But yeah, part of being an engineer is understanding this weird musician language that just makes no sense. So yeah, definitely, I could see how if you're a musician yourself, you understand it a little bit better, and that would certainly help. So as far as like getting into mastering, then what was it about mastering in particular that you found attractive? Like, instead of following the studio route of like doing mixing and recording and stuff like that, what ultimately got you involved in mastering and sticking with that?
Like I said, what first got me involved was the it felt good to be able to do it myself, because previously there was always the stage that you can't do yourself. You can't, at least at that point, you can't write your own exabyte tape to then be pressed onto CD. At some point, you could get CD burners, but with a blank costing like $20 or $30. That's kind of expensive. But then it came into the realm of possible to go that last mile and do it yourself. So that was really attractive. And I did that for my own productions, my own stuff. It was during studying, especially where the other students kind of realized, okay, that guy is doing that, and he seems to be kind of good at it. He seems to have a setup for it, because at that time I had a little home studio in my flat, like with Genelex, and it wasn't great, but it was consistent and it was a very controlled environment. So I loved doing that. And I think that a large part, this may be different for some people, but quite often it's the people who are in mastering are a special breed, because they like creation and creating stuff, but they also like pleasing other people and working for other people. So at least the ones that I know are quite service-oriented, and they kind of get a high from getting other people's work, trying to make it a little bit better, giving it back, and getting a thank you for it. That's a really cool thing. So I kind of miss live gigs, and I miss production in the studio and building a mix, or working on a production, forming a piece of music or a production with musicians. That's really cool. But that last bit of getting the best that someone else can do, especially, like, say, from a mixer, from a really good mixer, it's a really well-formed mix. Everything pulls together, everything works, is neatly aligned, all the automation is in the track, everything's good. And you kind of try to get it and make it a little bit better and send it back, and they like it. That's cool. So wanting to please and being service-oriented and admiring audio production, admiring mixes, etc., that's a large part for me of being a mastering engineer.
Of course, yeah, that's really cool. And I definitely find that being a mastering engineer, like, the fun of it, at least from what I see, is that, like, kind of to what you mentioned as well, which is that, like, you're seeing the best of someone else's work, and then you're just adding your thing on top of it, as opposed to when you're the person who is, like, producing and mixing a record. It's very easy to sometimes get into your own habits and, like, chase certain sounds, or have, like, a sound associated with you as a producer or as an engineer. Whereas with a mastering engineer, you're getting everyone else's sound, and then you're just augmenting it slightly. So, it's very rare that you would listen to a mastering engineer and be like, you can identify it by the tracks, because it's you're hearing someone else's mix, which is the bulk of the sound, right? So I think it kind of keeps things a little bit more exciting that you get that diversity in the projects that you get, and it kind of also makes it fun as far as problem solving, because now you have a new problem to solve every time you're mastering a track.
Yeah, there are a bunch of things that are really attractive about mastering to me. For one thing, you have new music every day. That's quite a big thing. When you've been doing this for so many years, you realize that mixers are on a song a day, maybe. Producers might be on a song in a week. Who knows? Or might be really stuck for a long time with one specific production. And I get something new every day, even if I get something that I don't particularly enjoy, or where I don't get into it that much. It's a relatively short time, so that's really cool. But yeah, like you say, the mix is kind of trying to tell you what it wants to be anyway. The mix already has that information in it. It's got the whole track. It's got the production in it. There's fairly little you need to do. In most cases, the better a track is mixed, the less you need to do. And it's all in there. It's kind of self-contained. There are so many attractive qualities about mastering. I just love it, yeah.
That's awesome. So then, as far as getting a new project and starting on a new project, what's your typical process look like there?
All right. Well, let's invent a client. Let's say a band member or producer might get in touch with me. They say, hey, Robin, we've got this album coming up, and it has to be released on that day. So it needs to be ready by, let's say, February 15th. And can we have a session, let's say, a week before, on February 7th, where you master all the mixes and get the complete album to us, and maybe allow a few days? Is that possible? So then we set a date. We allow for a few days in case there are some revisions. Everyone wants to have heard it and stuff. Yeah, and that's that. I get the mixes. I usually get them, well, both the mixes and the limited references if they use the limiter on the mix. I get that. I put that all in front of me. It's very important for me to have all the songs, not go just by song basis, but at the same time have kind of an overview what's coming up, what are the tracks, what's the common feature, what will be the sound of the album, what will be the level of the album, and then work on the individual tracks and then put the album together at the end. And then I send that out. I should also say I'm pretty much in the middle of nowhere here, not by US standards, but by German standards. I'm southwest of Germany. There aren't that many big cities around. So it's about a 6-hour drive from Berlin, which for many Germans, or is it 7 hours? It would be too much time to actually come here for the most time. So most of my sessions are unattended. Yeah, so best case scenario, I get to spend the whole day with the album, get to know it, listen to the mixes, get the feeling of the tracks for any themes through the album. And that's a pretty cool day.
Yeah, that sounds fun. As far as like processing goes or typical signal chains and that kind of thing, like what does that look like for you?
I usually do spot EQ digitally, so that if there's narrow EQ I want to apply, I've got my trusty old plug-in EQ. They don't sell that anymore, but it's called PL Par EQ. It's an older plugin, but it's very, very good. It's very surgical, and you can. So if you want to say take out with a Q of 20, take out 3 dB at 208 hertz on the sides, that's what you can do with it if you want. Then I go to my analog chain and I would patch in whatever I want. So there would be the Sontec EQs, there would be a Focusrite or Avalon EQs, and then followed by a few compressors. Let me see, what do I have here? So I have the Foot Control, the Rupert Neve Portico compressor. I have a Crane Song compressor and a Manley compressor. I would apply what I find good, and then it goes back into the box. And I would do my leveling and my limiting. And depending on what's needed, I'm quite flexible with limiting. I quite often automate things. So within a given song, it might be that there is a soft section with only piano and vocals, and I might have that on a very slow and a soft limiting preset that doesn't produce any distortion. And there might be, after that, a faster section with an open hi-hat and kick and snare, and that might run into faster limiting or clipping or anything like that. So that I would then do in the box.
Cool. So it sounds like you're doing like your first steps are typically more to do with like corrective EQ and doing your spot EQs first, and then you'll go, and then it goes to like kind of big picture EQ and then compression. Is that kind of correct?
Yeah, that's what I should have said. That's right. Yeah. So it would be corrective EQ, and it's very much spot. Like, I don't see the point in adding a corrective EQ to the whole song if it's only 10 seconds in the middle bit that need EQing. So I would automate that digitally. Then it goes into sweetening and broad brush EQ or sound machines, and then it goes into compression.
That's cool. And as far as leveling goes, you did say that you typically have like your limiter at the end. Are you kind of gain staging at the beginning of your chain to get it to a higher level first, or is that literally like after everything else that you start to boost the level?
No. I would get it to a decent level beforehand. But most of the time, the mixes will come in decently leveled. I know that if I get a mix and the peaks are at minus 40 dB or something, I know that I'm probably dealing with a beginner here. So then I would add some gain before I go into my analog chain. So I would make sure that it's got a decent level range to work with here.
Hey, real quick, just want to take a second to tell you all about our awesome podcast sponsor, MixFlip. In 2025, a great sounding portfolio is not enough. Instead, you need to be able to show the transformation that you bring. That is where MixFlip comes in. With MixFlip's interactive before and after player, potential clients can flip between the rough mix and your final master in real time, hearing the differences instantly. Plus, MixFlip offers traditional lossless audio players and mobile optimized landing pages that are perfect for your social bio. Want to book more clients? Start your 30-day free trial at mixflip.io and use the code MYM to save $5 on your first paid month. it's one of those things that I think it's interesting that you're talking about like automating and, applying EQ to certain things or certain sections of songs. Because I think that that's something that a lot of people forget about is like, they tend to just leave like this blanket EQ and, maybe it is that they actually focus, they really want this one section to pop, but then they don't realize that like, maybe you should just automate it for a certain section. And there's a lot of power in that as opposed to like this blanket statement across mix.
But it's easier for me because I come at the end when the track is pretty much mixed to 2-track already. Because if you've got all those different tracks and you don't see the forest, you see the individual trees and you work on those, you might not necessarily think, oh, in that section, it might be good to lower the whole section of dB and add an automation track. So for me, that's so easy to do. I would never know why you wouldn't do it. It makes so much sense. But it's understandable as long as you're dealing in the mix with individual instruments. You don't even have the ears or the mindset to as much think of the whole perception as a whole. That's my job. That's what I'm there for. But it's also automating the limiting, for example. That a lot of my power comes from that too. Is that I've got a song and I've got 2 different sections when they each come 5 times or something, and I very clearly see, okay, well, that limiting works in that part, that limiting works in that part. I choose different limiting for the different sections. It's so easy. But if you're in a mix scenario and you just want a mix bus limiter, set and forget, you just want to, use it for a sound or to get level, or you just slam it into it, you can't really do that easily. That's a bit more hassle. So I wouldn't fault anyone for it. And it also makes my life easier because it gives me power to very easily improve things that are absolutely obvious to me, where I can see, okay, before, because you had the individual tracks and all those instruments, you didn't think of that before. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's sometimes easy. Like, I get what you're saying, because like when you're in a mix, there's so many moving pieces that you're like so focused on all these individual things. And it can sometimes be hard to take that big picture view of your mix and kind of realize like, oh, the choruses need to pop a lot more. So, maybe we should automate something there. So I guess that's another reason why you should hire a mastering engineer who's like a third party to it, because then they have no preconceived notions of the track. They're able to come in and be like, yep, this section is a little weak, let's fix this one up or whatever. And I think sometimes having that third party perspective can be really positive. And, stuff like this, just like simple volume runs or like limiting bumps and stuff like that can really make a lot of impact as far as the overall power of a track. And it is something that ultimately I think if mixers can consider early on, then that is always good. And then you end up with something that's a little bit easier to work with as well. But yeah, certainly having this third party objective view is always a good thing there. Earlier, you talked about how one of the first things that you're doing with the record is that you're kind of just listening to it all and kind of finding common themes and trying to like figure out how to maybe make it all cohesive. And one project in particular that I wanted to ask you about was the 1975's Notes on a Conditional Form. That record there you mastered, and I love that record. And the crazy thing about that record is that like there's no consistency as far as like the tracks go. Like there's like thrashy songs, dancey songs, rock songs, pop songs, orchestral songs. Like it's all over the place. And I think that's one of the reasons why I like it, that it has so much diversity in it. But I'm curious to know from a mastering perspective, like how do you go about approaching a project like that and making sure that everything feels cohesive?
Well, it's an interesting album you asked about, because as far as the 1975 goes, that's their most ambitious piece of work. And I wasn't there when it was created, so I don't know what kind of different influences the different tracks have and over what time everything was done. But there's a lot of ideas in there. So how do you get it consistent? Well, first of all, that was mixed by my good friend Mike Crossie, and he's already done a great job of getting everything to work together. Because the album was produced, I think, by the band themselves. So by the drummer, George Daniel, and by the singer, Matt Healy. And George especially is kind of a technical genius as far as I can tell. And I love working with him, and so we talk together. But that album especially was very much band-driven, and it was very much, there's a lot of tinkering, and I think you can hear a lot of George's tastes in there. So all this is hearsay because I wasn't there. But that was a difficult album to master because things came in over a certain period of time and they kept tweaking after it was pretty much done. But that also gave me time to tweak on my mastering settings and get everything, make sure everything's working, everything's sitting okay, because the styles are so different. There are like piano ballads on there. There are like electronics tracks that could be, I don't know, by what would you say? That could be on a drum and bass or a Moby album or something like that. So there's just such variety on there. And it wasn't an easy album. It was the hardest to master of the 1975's albums because it's the most diverse, and it was, like I say, it was band produced. But I'm not even sure I can give you words to how does it work to get it into one. You just have to spend time with it. You have to live with it. The other, if I can tell you a bit about the other albums, for example, the subsequent album by the 1975 was completely different to my ears, and it was produced by Jack Antonoff, so the producer of Taylor Swift. And there, the album was very much coherent when I got it. I mastered it. I gave it back. It was done, pretty much. Whereas the previous record, the Notes on a Conditional Form record, that was a process of weeks. So that was very involved work. And both kind of workings are nice. It's not something I wouldn't choose to get complicated albums. If someone told me, well, this one is going to be complicated, it's going to have 100 tracks and they're all going to be different. But when you're done with it, you're kind of proud of it. There's a lot of me in that record as well. Whereas the subsequent record, it's called Being Funny in a Different Language, that was very coherent, a lot of acoustic. It was very produced on 10 songs, I think, done. Whereas Notes on Conditional Form, how many tracks are there? 21?
I can't 22? Remember on that. Yeah, it's a long one.
Yeah, it's a long record.
Yeah. So then, I've had a lot of mastering engineers come on here, and they'll talk about how, like, when they master a project, they're typically listening for like the biggest sounding production on a record first, and maybe that's what they start with, and then they'll kind of master around that project or around that song. With the record, like the Notes record, like, did you feel like there was certain styles of songs that you wanted to start with, or like, with it being so diverse, does that even matter? Is that even part of your normal approach? I guess is maybe another question.
Good question. Well, Notes on a Conditional Form. I'm trying to remember what the first single were. Most likely, the first single was quite a while before the album came out, so that kind of set the tone. And then when I get a bunch of tracks, let's say I get an album of 10 tracks, I do it a similar way. I anchor my ears to some track. Like on every record, you have a few or maybe one track where you think like, oh, okay, that works. That's cool. It's got a cool groove. Kick and snare balance is all right. It sounds sparkly. It sounds nice and fresh. So you kind of get used to the idea or thinking like, that song is really cool. That doesn't have any problems. And it's kind of really balanced and big and everything. And you keep coming back to that track. And that becomes like if you wish, the reference track for that album that you kind of orient yourself towards. And it's usually a track that doesn't have any problems, any big problems. That's kind of usually quite big or snappy or balanced or fresh sounding. It would be more often than not probably a bouncy or happy, or at least not a very gloomy song or something like that. So I tend to gravitate towards that, yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting because you bring up another good point there about how with a lot of records, the singles are released so well in advance. And so that might be your first exposure to a project, and you master that song and then it goes out in the wild. But then most of the time I would say the single is pretty indicative of the rest of the record. So, mastering to make everything else sound like the single is pretty safe, right? But again, with something like this, where like the singles are probably the biggest, poppiest song, and then you get like an orchestral song or a drum and bass song afterwards. It's like I could see how that would just be like a bit of a mindfuck, just trying to get it all to come together, right?
Exactly. If you remember a few years ago, it was the case that you had to hand in your vinyl masters so long before the actual digital streaming releases, because the pressing plants were so booked long in advance. I think it was something like maybe 9 or 10 months at the most. It's gotten better. It's gotten down to maybe 3 months or something like that. And at that time, if you can imagine, if you have to hand in a completely finished master that's not going to be touched at all, 9 months before the album comes out, then so many bands and mixers are tempted to revisit the work afterwards, So that's actually what I had a lot. Still waiting for people to find out at some point about some bands that the song sounds different on the vinyl release than it is on the CD release. Like, oh, there's a different bass line there, and stuff like that. So, yeah, and as you said, the singles can be quite a lot earlier. You kind of have a lot of releases lately where essentially the people, or at least some artists, aren't really making records or albums anymore, but they're making a string of singles, and at the end, then they're collected and put on an album. So that kind of works out differently as well. But you just try your best to make it sound cohesive. I think the album that you mentioned, The Notes on a Conditional Form by the 1975, does it have the first song, People?
Yeah, I think that's the one. I think
that's the one.
I gotta pull up the record to find out, yeah.
Whereas like a full-on industrial heavy metal scream fest, but the band is actually quite poppy, and it's like it's so different. And imagine you master that and think like, okay, well, I guess we're a metal band now.
They have no other songs in their discography that sound like that.
No. And at the time, I remember listening to it. I loved the track, but even I was surprised. But I thought like, okay, well, that's quite a statement. I mean, it's cool and everything, but at that point, you don't know how the album is going to turn out. But if you have a good producer and a good mixer at hand, Mike Rossi in this case, who kind of makes sure that things over time stay reasonably focused and at least similar or comparable, so you can put them on the same record without it sounding like you have a different band there. I guess that helps too, yeah.
Yeah. Do you ever find yourself having to like remaster the singles after the fact to like match the rest of the record once you hear all the other tracks?
Yeah, for loudness sake, yes. Not so much EQ-wise. EQ usually stays the same with me. So do you know the company or the website muso.ai?
Yep. I'm familiar with that.
They have a cool feature, and it's like when you sign up to be pro, or you get like a little evaluation period, that they make a playlist with all the songs that you're credited on that they know about, and you can listen to your Robin Schmidt play out in Spotify or something like that. When I'm doing some sports or training, so I listen to music, and I did that for quite a while. And it was really interesting because there are songs in there that are 20 years old that I mastered 20 years ago. And I kind of thought that, well, my taste has probably changed over time, plus I've probably gotten better or less worse, or I don't know. But to my surprise, it's very consistent, the EQ. In my playlist of 20,000 songs or something, over 20 years, I pretty much rarely feel the need to adjust EQ or to even think like, oh, that has a touch too much bass. It's very consistent. And I find that with albums and with pre-release singles, it's the same thing for me. Pretty much when I've mastered something and they ask, well, do you have to remaster it when it goes on the album in 6 months, or do you charge extra or whatever? Usually I say, well, it's probably going to be good. We're probably not going to have to change anything. The only thing I might have to change, and that's quite often though, is that you find that when you get the album of 10 tracks, kind of get a level, a volume that works for the album. Where it's like, okay, I can get it fairly loud and I don't have to break anything. It sounds fresh and cool. But the pre-release single, I need to get that louder or need to get that less loud to make it fit well or sit well. So I adjust volume quite often with pre-release singles.
That makes sense. And that wouldn't be like an obvious change that anyone else would notice. Like, if it's just dropping it down in volume overall, it's going to be very clean and no one's going to see that. As opposed to, if you mess with the EQ and stuff like that, then you're going to hear a difference for sure, right?
Yeah. I just did an album for a German industrial band, and there was a pre-release single. I just dropped it by 3 dBs because the pre-release single was just piano and vocals. It was kind of like a stylistically very different thing. No one said anything. I mean, it just sounds natural on the album now, but it's 2.5 or 3 dBs quieter than it was before. But it still works. That's fine.
I'm sure too, like, it's interesting that you mentioned that you have that consistency in the EQ curve of all your tracks. And I guess that makes sense. Like, you have I guess maybe, we talked earlier about how mixers will have their own unique sound, and maybe that's the sound for you, which is like just this response of the frequencies that feels good to your ears. Obviously, that's going to be heavily impacted by the balance of a mix and everything too. But yeah, that makes sense. So like you have this comfortability, I guess, with where things should sit frequency wise, and that makes a lot of sense to me, and even process wise too.
If you find that you've got a certain amount of headroom or a certain amount of space for the instruments to go, and you have a certain amount of sparkle or air or high frequency, then whether you have a dB or more or less space, it'll both work probably. If you don't feel like it's trying to get out of a box that you've confined it to. If there's a certain section or a certain space where I feel comfortable with a mix, where all the instruments have their space, their dynamics, and it kind of sits together well, then you've got some variability there. That's fine.
Yeah, for sure. As far as like creating consistency between tracks on a record, like, are you listening generally for like, I've had some people on the show before that have said that they'll listen for vocals and like that's the thing that they're listening for. Do you factor in like specific instruments to help you get that consistency across the record, or is it more just like the overall frequency balance or volume levels that you're?
It's the overall with me. I've heard that thing about the vocals that some people find it very helpful. Oh wait, I should add a caveat for leveling. For leveling tracks, I find it can sometimes help very much to listen to the vocals. So, for example, if you have stylistically different tracks over an album, okay, let's say we've got 10 tracks which are rock, and you've got one track which is a quiet ballad. How should that sit? Should that be at an equal level with a whole full band, or should that drop consistently? And personally, I find that if I'm not given the artist's preference for this, I will usually go for a fairly consistent level over the different styles. So that works. But other than that, I think it's the overall tone that I like. I'm a drummer first, so I really don't like it when drums get noticeably, how do you say, when they get kind of like their oomph or their sparkle taken off, when transients are deaded, when they fall below the vocals, or maybe even fairly invisible when the vocals are singing. I don't like that. I still like to feel them and feel the snap. I'm a guitarist too, so they've got to have their space. At the same time, I love instrumental productions. Some of the best days are if I know, okay, well, today, the first half of the day, I'm making an instrumental recall for an album. So I'll master the whole album as it was done, but without the vocals on it. That's a great day because I get to listen to all the arrangements, to the harmonies, to the little intricacies of the mix. That's cool. I also love it with vocals, transports the emotions. So it's everything. It's hard to reduce it down to one point. The vocal thing, I find that interesting or helpful when it's only about overall volume. Other than that, it's the whole band always.
Yeah. It's interesting that you bring up that idea of like the drums being quieter than the vocal and that kind of stuff, because obviously the way that the mix gets delivered to you is going to heavily impact the work that you have to do to it. Do you find that there are any like common problems that you see in mixes that are submitted for mastering, or like, is there anything you can recommend to someone who's maybe mixing a project to help set their mix up to make it easier for mastering or to get better results in the end with mastering?
There's one obvious thing that's become quite important, which I think there are still a lot of people don't know about that, which is the most important thing for me is to get your mix the way you heard it while mixing. So if you have a limiter on it, send it to me with limiter on it. Also send me a version without the limiter on it, but don't assume that that's better because it's got something taken off. The best thing will likely be what you heard during mixing. It's not going to get magically good because you take some processor off. It might be something else. It might not be the mix anymore. Who knows? So the most important thing is that I really want to hear what you heard while mixing, because that's the good thing. That's the good stuff. That's what I want. Maybe I can make it better if something's taken off, but it's not a given. Other than that, common mistakes. I think they vary over time, and it's hard to generalize. If this was 20 years ago, I'm sure I would think of different things. But yeah, the main thing is listen to what you're doing and send me that, and try to make it as good as you possibly can.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting because I feel like different mastering engineers have different opinions of the whole master limiter thing with a mix, right? Some people want it, some people don't. And I guess like, it all comes down to just how people are slamming into it to begin with, right? Like, if you're going super hard, everything, like you run the risk of maybe reducing transients and stuff like that, which could become problematic in the mastering stage. And obviously you don't want that in the mixing either. But kind of to your point as well, it's like, if that's just how people are listening to the mix and they like it, then you kind of have to trust their judgment. If those transients are gone, but that's what they like, then so be it,
The other thing is that limiters these days, they're not only becoming cleverer, but they're becoming more involved. So they're taking large parts of the mix bus compressor duties. So for example, if you're mixing into Ozone or into Pro L2, what's called Fab Filter, or some other mixers, they usually got times these days, and they're kind of processing your mix before it goes to a brick wall limiter. And those times are part of your mix, most likely. So don't just take it off and send it unheard. If you want to send something that's got some more, listen to it first, because it might have things changed. One of the most common things I'm hearing when people take the limiter off is that the vocal levels might change. Suddenly they're not embedded in the right place in the mix. They seem too far out or too far back. And the kick snare balance might be off. So where before you have a kick and a snare, and they're beat and backbeat are on the, it might be more often than not, it might be something, and that kind of changes the groove and the appeal of the mix. And I don't want that, because the first thing I would then have to do is rebuild what the mixer was trying to do, try to make it as good, and then improve on it. I'd rather start from the point that was intended. That said, what I often do is if I get a slam mix and an unlimited mix, I might ask the mixer, hey, the limiter sounds really cool, but it's a bit slammed and I think I can do it better. Can you send me the same track, but with 2 dB less limiting? So with your threshold of the limiter just eased off 2 dBs or 1 dB or 3 dBs, and then I can see what I'm working with. So that's quite a common thing. Some top mixers also do that by default, like not naming names, but like one of the mixers who's doing insane amounts of mixing these days. Like they send the mix out limited and an unlimited version, and that's limiting minus 2 dB. And I personally find that mostly the limited version seems more right to my ears, but it gives me the ability to kind of get there and have it sound a bit fresher and make it sound a bit bigger.
Mm-hmm. But I like that approach. I think that does make a lot of sense. And it certainly would vary depending on like the caliber of the mixers that you're working with. Someone who knows what they're doing is going to be treating their compression and their limiting very intentionally, and as opposed to someone who's maybe just getting started with this, they might just hear like, oh, I got to slam a track with a limiter, and like, they're just doing it out of what they think is right, as opposed to like being very aware of what's happening to the rest of their mix. So I could see how that would definitely change the perception of it. But I do like that idea of like having a less limited version and a limited version, because then it's still, at the end of the day, it's still the sound of the mix as they heard it. It's just maybe a little bit eased off for your sake to have that transient energy and the dynamics.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's very cool. When it comes to mastering, another big topic, and you kind of touched on this briefly, is the idea of level. And you talked about how you have consistency as far as EQ goes amongst all your masters. Do you feel like there's a consistency there as far as levels that you shoot for?
Reasonably. I would say that in order to be a professional mastering guy at this point in time, or 5 years ago or something, you kind of need to play in the same ballpark. Like you can't just decide, well, for ideological reasons, I like the level to be lower or higher or whatever. You can't just decide something like that. You need to deliver what the people expect or what they ask you to. And if you're good at that, then you're going to have a good time, as the meme goes. So if you've got some practice and some experience in getting things to the volume that people expect, while also hurting the audio less or very little, then you've got a good starting point. And I would say, I don't know, should we talk RMS or Lufs or something like that?
Yeah.
There are so many standards. So I know what my meters look like, and I know I'm in the ballpark of what everyone else is doing. So that's kind of what you have to aim for. Another good tip for people starting out is, as a mastering engineer, you usually want to make sure that the masters you sound back is louder than the mix you receive. Every mixer is also going to know that as the demo-itis. So if you have a loud demo of a song, you're going to have a tough time selling your mix if the demo is louder. If so, you're going to have to do some explaining or some priming, or have to make sure that first your mix is approved and then you drop the level to make it sound better. Whatever. Yeah. I feel that we're in a fairly good spot at the moment. I found that maybe 10 or 15 years ago or something, the levels were kind of crazy, while people were still using fairly standard limiting, and a lot of music suffered because of that. And I think we're kind of out that valley. It didn't get much quieter overall, the expectation, but people got better at working to make it sound decent at high volumes. A lot of Bob Ludwig masters, for example, or let's say, no, let me start another way. Ted Jensen, I referenced him before. He got a name around the early 2000s, especially to make good sounding rock masters at a high level that had a snare that actually worked. Whereas at the same time, some other engineers might have just slapped a Waves L2 hardware on it, and you didn't have a snare anymore. And people were fine with that. Well, I wasn't. And Ted Jensen, for example, or I'm sure a lot of other people as well, but his name comes to mind, showed that there is another way. You can choose to process differently, because if you're mastering a Green Day record, retaining that punch and that snare is important, and it's not as important as you can have a bit of grit on that album, but you need to have that dynamic impact still on it. And that worked. In turn, that again influenced people who might before have produced very flattened dynamically masters, and I think we're in a good space right now.
Yeah, I feel like the whole topic of levels, like obviously it's been an issue discussed in mastering forever, but there still are a lot of people that just really don't understand, and it's maybe just a matter of not understanding the types of processing that happens in the mastering or mixing stage. But there's still a lot of people that just think, yeah, the louder is better, and I think that there are also becoming more and more mastering engineers who are being more vocal about you don't need it loud, and things are getting turned down on Spotify and all. Like, there's a lot of reasons to justify quieter masters as well. Yeah, I kind of agree with you. I think that at the end of the day, like, people who are sending their stuff for mastering, they want it to sound better than it came in, and often they associate mastering with level, even though that's a small part of what we do. It's still the thing that a lot of people associate with mastering. So there's a very fine line of that education versus like just providing what the client wants, right?
People expect it to be sounding A, better, and B, louder, and both. So that kind of puts a box around what I can do, because I personally, I found that too. You can be ideologically driven, or you can decide for yourself, well, I want my masters to be more dynamic, but there's no guarantee that the client will accept it. I've had it before that, look, let's say an album has 12 tracks, 11 tracks come back sounding better and louder, but one track needs to go down. I tell the producer of that album, who's a technical person, hey, look, I made that track quieter. If you want to see what I did or compare, make sure you level adjust. All right? I did everything right, but it could still be that they just don't get it. That they say, well, I understand the loudness bit, but I think that track sounds weaker than it did before. And you just think, no, it's not. I'm just going to make it louder to get approval. And then afterwards tell them I dropped it again, but it has the same EQ and everything, So it's such a psychological topic. When it comes to level, people are not objective. And even with playback adjustment by Spotify or playback loudness normalization, people are still subjective animals, and you need to get it through them first to get it on there, and they might be the gatekeepers of what gets allowed and what doesn't. To a certain extent, when you're working with label A&Rs and catalog people or business people, or working for managers who aren't really tuned into that, it might even be that you need the level to get it approved and published and okayed, But the sound quality is up to you. You need to live with that. You need to, it doesn't matter if you're a mastering engineer, mix engineer, but make sure it sounds good at whatever level you're required. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's such a personal taste thing, I guess, at the end of the day, too, right? Because like even with like the normalization stuff happening on Spotify, I feel like there's a lot of engineers who are now just focused on like, okay, now I can breathe. I don't need it super loud, and I'll master quieter masters that have more dynamics and stuff like that. And that's one philosophy. And then there are the other people who are still thinking like, well, not everyone has the normalization turned off, so we're gonna master it as loud as it needs to be to make it consistent with other tracks when that normalization isn't around. So I guess I don't know that there is a right or wrong, because in some cases maybe the quality suffers because you're just shooting for loudness. But either way, I guess at the end of the day, like you need something that just feels consistent across the record, that has the power and all that stuff.
But it works out a lot of the time. It's quite strange. You would think that working in this line of business, every month or every year you look back and you have tens of albums or whatever, where you think like, oh, I took this too far. This doesn't sound good anymore. But it's surprisingly few albums that are in the spot where you think, maybe I should have mastered that a dB quieter. It's quite rare. It's amazing how that works. And even at the time when you thought, oh, this is so loud, it can't get any louder or something, there's a whole bunch of tastes, like you say, and there's quite a bandwidth of possibilities, and it's still art, as we say. So, yeah.
Yep. So then at the end of the day, what ultimately in your mind makes a great sounding mastered mix?
I think it's just words that come to mind, but the word balance seems to be good. Like I said, everything has to feel like it's pulling at the same string. All the instruments, all these signals, be it synths, voices, guitars, whatever, they all need to feel like they're there for the music. It's got to tickle your ears. Like, it's got to be nice to listen to. You've got to get something from it. But there has to be a balance to it all. Like, you'll notice if some instrument is sticking out like a sore thumb and you just wish it wasn't there, then it probably shouldn't be there. And the same can be said for arrangements or for sounds. Like, say you listen to, what's that Paul McCartney Christmas song I listened to the other day?
Simply Having a Wonderful Christmas.
Time. Exactly. And you've got that synth playing and you think like, oh God, that's so dated. I wish they chose a different sound, because the song is good.
It's so really loud too. I hate that synth.
Yeah. It's like, what were they thinking? Like just an hour ago with my wife, I was listening to some old Enya tracks, productions. And I said to her, those Enya songs, when they are just vocals and one synth. And it's like, I gather that's a really good song, but you couldn't produce it this way today. Because to me, if I heard that today, I would say, that's a nice sketch. How's the song going to go? Like, what's it going to be? But it's just a sketch. It's just one synth and a few reverby vocals. And it's great. It works as a song, but it doesn't feel like it's finished with arrangements and instruments too.
Yeah. But I guess that is kind of the interesting thing about this, is that like we as engineers approach this with a very technical mindset, and we get into the weeds of like, we know what we could do with a song. But I guess at the end of the day, like when it gets in the listener's hands, they don't care. Like, all of this technical work to some degree doesn't matter. If it's going to come down to if it's a good song or not.
But not only that, I think that's an oversimplification. A lot of people say that, but it's not just about the song. It's also the context of the time. Like you see, for example, with A Wonderful Christmas Time, or those Enya songs, they happen in a specific time and it worked for that time. And that song is still good, but it wouldn't work today if it came out, because everyone would be like, what kind of sound is that? Wop, 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 wop. It's like, oh, no. So it always happens at a specific time for people, and then they connect it to their lives, and then that song lives in there. So, yeah, the song has to be good, but there's still a justification for us, for people who engineer, who orchestrate, who tweak knobs. And so aesthetic changes with the times, and it's good that there are people working on, adjusting it to that time. And it might need to be updated at some point, who knows? if Paul McCartney would like to re-record that song, I'd like that. Yes.
But it makes sense. It's like popular music generally has a pretty consistent sound to it. Like there's like a consistency as frequencies, levels, and, maybe the balance of instrumentation. There's usually some sort of coherency there. And then it does take some weird band to like mess with the formula and you maybe get lucky, and then that changes the direction of it.
That's true, but it's also stylistically different. Like if you go from one style to the other, there are quite different ideas. For example, think of a jazz guitar. Think of a semi-acoustic guitar through a Roland jazz chorus, and with all the highs and treble turned down, and it's starting, it's like you couldn't do that sound in rock or pop. It just wouldn't cut through. It wouldn't work. But that's kind of become an ideal for them. Or if you think of a jazz bass drum, that wouldn't work in the heavy metal track where it needs to be, whereas in the jazz it needs to be boom, or boom, rather. So they're kind of aesthetics that are kind of built up and then become a standard that everyone works to, and it can be different for different things. It's quite interesting. I remember. Do you remember when that whole autotune took off?
Oh yeah. With Cher and everything, and T-Pain.
Yeah. Where at first you thought like, haha, they did a mistake and they thought it sounded cool, and they said, oh, it was a vocoder. No, it wasn't. We all know it, but sure, let's pretend. Until at a later time, you have all kind of people singing into autotune or even rapping into autotune, and that's kind of a stylistic element. Who saw that coming? Not me. And before my time as well, distorted guitar, overdriven amps, as the name gives it away. It's just an amp that's driven too hard. Okay, it becomes its own thing. It's really interesting. What's going to be the next stylistic effect that people use? I don't know.
Yeah, it's interesting. I do think that some of that is aided by the fact that like digital technology has made it more accessible to people, and because of the fact that you can add a gazillion plugins to things, people are just experimenting and finding all these unique ways. But to some degree, I mean, I don't know. Maybe I'll take back my words in a few years. But like I feel like things are just starting to get so overly processed that we're going to start to find this other side of things where people are going to want to strip things down a little bit more, make things a little bit more human, and less CGI drums and all that kind of stuff. And that might end up being the way.
I think that's already happening. For one thing, there's kind of a resurgence of the acoustic singer-songwriter. We just want one guitar, one smoky room, vulnerability, and kind of a naturality to the sound. And it kind of has become big already. So I think that's already happened to an extent. And the other thing is, like you said, the thing that we all notice about AI pictures when we're scrolling Instagram, and you realize, okay, some of these pictures or videos are AI generated or processed. And very quickly you get to the point where you just don't want to see it. I don't want to see it if it's not real. Because then I know, okay, that's a great looking place. Shame it doesn't exist. What do I care about it? I don't want to see it. Like you say, why wouldn't the same thing happen in audio to an extent? So, sure.
Yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense. And I agree. I think also with AI becoming a factor in music production as well, we're going to start to notice that AI sound or whatever it is that, there's going to be a consistency there.
At the moment, there is definitely consistency. I don't think I've knowingly heard convincing AI vocals yet. Like even in songs when they use AI engines, there's also always this chorusy sounds and kind of slightly softened consonants where you think like it's stringing along, this
like very synthetic.
Yeah. So, and I think at the moment that still gives it away.
Yeah. It'll be, I mean, if AI does what it's supposed to do and it is learning and constantly improving, then it should be, in theory, harder to detect that kind of stuff later on. But yeah, I mean, it's learning based off of trends and what exists in the market right now. And so, again, someone else will find a way of making something unique or more organic or more human sounding, and that'll be the thing that people gravitate towards because it's different, So yeah, it's really interesting.
We're going to see if people will want to consume that. That remains to be seen. It might be the case that, when I see photo of places that I cannot visit, then I'm just not interested. Like on my phone, it might be the same thing that people want the emotion of a real person. So the fad of AI generated songs or lyrics or emotions might just dull us to that. Who knows? I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, we could probably have a whole other conversation about the future of AI and music and all that stuff. But man, Robin, this has been great. I've really enjoyed having this conversation and learning more about your processes and your approach to things. And yeah, I think it's really, really important for people to hear this stuff, and really helpful for people to get a sense of how you approach your records. So thank you for taking the time to do this. If people want to learn more about you or follow you or maybe even work with you, like what's the best way for them to do that?
Ooh, you can follow me on Instagram. It's robin.schmidt.mastering. It's ROBIN.SCHMIDT.MASTERING. Just follow me on there.
Awesome. Well, again, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. I really appreciate it.
Sure, my pleasure.
So that was my chat with Robin Schmidt, and I really enjoyed that. I loved learning more about his work with the 1975 and getting some insight into what has gone into mastering some of their records and some of the challenges that come along with that. All of their records are amazing, and Robin's mastered a bunch of their records. But the one record that we talked a lot about in this episode, the album's called Notes on a Conditional Form. If you're not familiar with that record, check it out. It is a great example of a record that has so many different sounding songs, different genres, and lots of different amounts of detail and dynamics and all sorts of stuff. So it is an excellent example of how mastering can definitely unify a whole bunch of different tracks on a record and make everything sound cohesive and make the experience enjoyable as a listener. So I would definitely say check that record out, because it's an awesome sounding record. I think after you have listened to this episode, you'll start to appreciate a lot of the work that went into making that sound the way it does. So definitely cool to learn more about that. And I also really enjoyed hearing him talk about how when he analyzes his discography over 20 years of being a mastering engineer, there's consistency in his frequency balance. And I think that is a really interesting thing there, because no matter what happens as far as musical trends and whether people are mastering things that are loud or quiet or dynamic or soft or using samples or, different sounding guitars and whatnot, like no matter what happens musically, it's interesting for him to say that he has consistency in the frequency balance. And I think when we're mixing, we tend to get lost in the intricate details of every instrument and getting the tones right and that kind of thing. But at the end of the day, we need to make mixes that feel balanced and that have that consistency. So to kind of train your ears to hear that overall frequency balance is a really important skill. Obviously, it's something that Robin has mastered, and he's done it over a long career. But that is something that I would love to encourage you to do, is just learn how mixes should sound, not from a tone standpoint, but like from a frequency balance standpoint. Like don't pay attention to like the tones of the drums or the guitars or that kind of thing, but like how does the mix feel as a whole? What does that low end feel like coming out of your speakers, or the top end, or the mid range? Once you start to understand that stuff, mixing becomes a lot easier, because you know how to slot instruments in their place in the mix to get that frequency balance. And sometimes that's a matter of volume, sometimes it's a matter of EQ or compression, that kind of thing. But you want your record to stack up against other songs, and understanding that overall frequency balance is a really big part of that. So yeah, start to analyze music and maybe even lean into certain tools like iZotope has total balance control, which shows you like an average frequency curve for certain genres of music. Or you can use things like metric AB and compare your song against other songs and look at the frequency meters there. Or just even without tools like that, just pull up a frequency meter. Most DAWs have that. But start analyzing the overall curve of most songs, and you'll start to see that there is a bit of a trend there. There is a bit of a shape that a lot of songs in certain genres will have. And so pay attention to that. And like I said, your mixes will become better as a result of being aware of that stuff. So those are some little tips that I can give you there as far as how to achieve that. Now, the other side to that is that it's one thing to know the overall frequency balance that you're shooting for, but it's another to know how to actually do that, right? Like you're not just going to boost all the low end in your mix to make it match a certain frequency curve. You have to be strategic with how you process your kicks or your bass tracks, or, the low end of your guitar or the mid range of your guitar, whatever it is, right? And all of that takes an intricate knowledge of the tools, what to listen for, how to use those tools to get that sound that you hear in your head, and ultimately how to come up with a solid beginning to end process for mixing that allows you to move confidently through every stage and get the results you want. So if you're struggling with that, if you feel like you can't quite get your mixes to sound competitive and to sound as good as your favorite records, and you're not sure what tools to be using, maybe you're relying on presets or you're just kind of slapping together plugins hoping that something's going to work. If you want one-on-one help with your tracks to make sure that you have that repeatable process and you have the confidence of how to use your tools to get that sound that you hear in your head, I would love to help you. And inside of my coaching program, Amplitude, that's exactly what I do. I work one-on-one with my students to walk you through this process and to work with you as you work on your tracks. I'm giving you feedback along the way. I'm giving you guidance and instructing you so that you're completely clear on what you need to do. There's no guessing, there's no overwhelm. Instead, we make it very clear how to break down the process so that you can get the results you want. So once again, if you're interested in learning more about that and getting one-on-one help, make sure to check out MasterYourMix.com/amplitude, and you can find all the details there. And then with that said, we've reached the end of this episode. Thank you so much for sticking around, and I can't wait to chat with you in the next one. We'll talk soon. Take care. Thanks for listening to the Master Your Mix podcast. Please make sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast app and leave a review. If you have any questions or comments for the podcast, send an email to questions@masteryourmix.com. And for more information on how to create pro recordings from your home studio, visit MasterYourMix.com.